Margaret Fuller, Anne O'Hare McCormick, Pauline Frederick. Recognize any of those names? Author and journalist Brooke Kroeger introduces us to the inspiring women of the last 180 years who pushed open doors for female journalists of today. Hi, it's Angie from HEC Books, where we talk with authors about their latest titles. Click the subscribe button to see all of our latest conversations, and stick around to find out how enterprising female journalists sought out opportunities for change. Welcome to St. Louis, Brooke Kroeger. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here.
I was going to say, back to Missouri. You're a Kansas City native.
I am. And I've spent time here, too, researching one of my books at WashU. And there was a beau, in high school, and conventions. And once in 1969, I went to the Muni Opera to see Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fonteyn, a really memorable night.
Well, let me tell you, this is such an important book. 180 years of women in journalism. You just mentioned that, you've done books on Nellie Bly and Fannie Hurst. What made you feel like, I need to do this? The world needs this.
I was just getting ready to retire after 22 years as a professor at NYU. And in my inbox comes a message from a wonderful editor whom I did not know at Knopf, which is a wonderful publishing house, saying that he was keen to commission a work about the history of women in journalism because he couldn't find one, and would I be interested in discussing it? So you can imagine what an email like that is like in our business. They don't come very often. And so I just thought, heck yes, I would really like to do that. And a lot of this material, as you noted, I've worked with in some way or another. What was different about this from previous work was establishing that continuum. So I went decade by decade by decade, and I used two search terms, women and journalism, not woman, but women, journalism. Women, journalism, both with quotes around them, doing each, 1840 to 1849, 1850 to 1859, just like that, and to see what came up. Because I didn't want to go with my own thoughts about this because they've been formed by what other people have written or what books have been written. And sometimes books are written because the material's available, and the person has an interesting life. But does that mean they were important in the field? Does that mean they were creating change? It doesn't really tell you that. It just tells you a great story. And great stories are great. It's not to denigrate that in any way. But I was after something different. So I'd see, whose names keep coming up over and over again. If someone writes a book on the 25 most important women of the 19th century, or the women writers, let's say, what names keep recurring that are also journalists? So those would be some of my keys. Someone like Dorothy Thompson, who's probably a name you don't know anymore because people have forgotten her. She was, the it girl of the 1930s and 1940s. The level of her popularity, of her wealth from journalism was just extraordinary. She wrote a column for the Herald Tribune and then had radio shows, etc., and became extremely important as an analyst and columnist, often almost always on world affairs or important domestic affairs. So there's a point where in 1 year, she is profiled by both the Saturday Evening Post, which is just about as middlebrow as you can get, and the New Yorker, which is just about as, up there highbrow as you can get. Both, not one issue, but 2 consecutive issues of each magazine. Now, that tells me I have to talk about Dorothy Thompson. So things like that would happen. And then I had ideas that I thought were in some ways more important than the stories. So the stories are often about women you've never heard of and wouldn't have heard of, wire service reporters, people like me, the people that aren't in the public eye so much. But the things that happened to them stood for what was happening in the decade to others. So when people say the book is encyclopedic, I say, no, it's not a bunch of mini profiles. The stories are advancing the stronger thread, which is this extraordinary continuum of what I like to call progress, setback, push, pull, right up to the present.
What I thought was interesting, too, is it wasn't that they were just reporting on things. They were changing the way that people were reporting on things. Everybody, right?
That's true. it's not that they were setting out to change things. Some of this happened by circumstance and happenstance. So, for example, getting women into the field, like into those newsrooms in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, how did that happen? There were women who wanted to and were extremely talented, A++ talents, who were also very savvy networkers. So they would do things like write for the abolition press. The abolition press wasn't very wealthy, right? So they needed talent. Well, they were willing to look more widely for talent than where you usually looked, which was to white men. And so by getting their copy in there, well, everybody was reading it. So then from there, these women of the 1860s catapult to writing for The Atlantic, for the New York Times. So very, very smart strategy. And men, editors who were willing to help get them a leg up. So that was pretty great. Then later on, the newspapers, as they become large and metropolitan, realize that women readers are a good idea because that's going to increase circulation, which is going to increase revenue. So they start to develop women's fare, the women's pages, which then become a ghetto for women in a not great way and very hard to get out of because men develop a way of talking about it to say that this is really all women can do. They're very good at gossip. They're very good at society coverage. They're very good at fashion coverage. And these are the things you should be doing. And really, you're not very accurate. So we can't put you in the news pages. There was a lot of that. And that goes on for 50 years or so, quite a while. So that's a problem. And then the stunt girls come along in the 1880s. So this would be Nellie Bly and all of her imitators, of whom there were many across the country, many, many, many. Polly Pry, Annie Laurie, there's lots of them. And they get to do stunts. They are doing detective work. They are doing exposés, undercover, sensations that the public really eats up. But not forever. For, about 6 or 7 years, this is a pretty great trend, and then it dies from overexposure. But it was a place where women could show their mettle. They could show what they were able to do. So that was important. So they introduced a new form, but at the same time, they were showing that the things you think about us are not true in the aggregate. There are many of us who have these skills. And then come the front page girls, one per paper. All these things I've told you about is one per paper, never more. And they're women doing what the men are doing, sometimes writing the pants off the men, but one per paper who can really write what everybody else is writing. And then, slowly the change starts to come. Usually in places, it comes more readily in places that are suffering financially because they're more open to having women.
Just like the abolition papers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or war. Mm-hmm. The men go off to war and the women get opportunity. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a story like that for a long time.
Yeah, because when we talk about those early, it wasn't just that you're an awesome writer. You had to be savvy in even getting in the position, as you noted.
And you had to have men who were willing to have open enough minds to give you opportunity. Mm-hmm. We can't ignore that. What Ralph Waldo Emerson did for Margaret Fuller. She's this gangly, ugly by her own description, off-putting character that people find quirky and weird, and she does something strange with her eyelids and, has an incredible gift of discourse. And he becomes friendly with her. She actually seeks out this friendship. Almost like a mad intellectual crush, as I say, because that's how she goes after it. She makes sure he gets copies of her work and finally gets invited to the Emerson home for 2 weeks. And they become friends. And also with his wife, they all become friends. And from there, he makes her the editor of the Dial. And Horace Greeley is part of that circle of transcendentalists. His wife is crazy about Margaret Fuller and coming down for her conversations, these salons that she's running, and convinces her husband to make her the literary editor of the Tribune, the biggest paper in the country. Imagine.
And that was in 1844. Remember, at that time, women had limited rights to property, inheritance, and participation in court proceedings. Watch part 2 of this interview for some of the crazy-making experiences of these women journalists. Most of them are hard to believe.